The Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren looked like a guaranteed success. Carbon fiber engineering, supercharged power, Formula One DNA, and a badge that promised perfection. On paper, it had everything a legendary supercar should have. Yet behind the beauty and brute force was a quiet problem no one wanted to admit. This wasn't a car that failed because it was slow or flawed. It faded because it tried to satisfy two worlds at once and fully belonged to neither. By the end of this video, you'll understand why one of the most advanced, expensive, and beautiful supercars ever built didn't fail mechanically, but still disappeared far earlier than anyone expected. Subscribe Royale for more interesting, fascinating, knowledgeable, entertaining video. The story of the Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren does not begin in a design studio or a wind tunnel. It begins with ambition, a car born from two worlds. At the turn of the 2000s, Mercedes-Benz was riding high. Formula One success, engineering dominance, and a renewed confidence in its global image gave the company a dangerous idea. What if Mercedes built a road car that carried the aura of its racing supremacy? Not a tuned luxury coupe, not a softened Grand Tourer, but something closer to a modern legend. At the same time, McLaren stood at a crossroads of its own. Revered for its obsessive engineering and racing DNA, McLaren had already proven with the F1 that it could build one of the greatest road cars in history. But that achievement came at enormous cost. If McLaren was going to build another road car, it needed scale, stability, and a partner with deep pockets. On paper, the partnership was perfect. Mercedes would provide prestige, resources, and global reach. McLaren would provide carbon fiber mastery, race-bred engineering, and performance credibility. What could possibly go wrong? The answer is simple and devastating. They were trying to build two different cars at the same time. From the very first sketches, disagreement lived beneath the surface. Mercedes envisioned something elegant, refined, and usable. A car that could cross continents at impossible speeds without punishing its driver. A Super GT fast, composed, reassuring. A machine that still felt like a Mercedes. McLaren saw something else entirely. To McLaren, a flagship road car had to feel raw, intense, purpose-built. Weight was the enemy. Comfort was secondary. The car should demand respect, not adapt to its driver. It should feel closer to a race car than a luxury product. Neither vision was wrong, but neither could fully coexist. And so, compromise became the foundation. The SLR was built around a carbon fiber monocoque, advanced, expensive, and technically stunning. Its supercharged V8 delivered brutal straight-line performance. Its brakes were aerospace-grade. Its proportions were dramatic, long-nosed, and unmistakably exotic. Yet layered on top of that were decisions that softened the edge. An automatic transmission instead of a manual. A heavier curb weight than its rivals. A cabin designed for comfort rather than minimalism. A ride tuned to survive real roads, not just racetracks. To Mercedes, these were strengths. To purists, they were red flags. And to the market, they were confusing. The SLR arrived with extraordinary expectations and an equally extraordinary price. Buyers weren't just purchasing speed. They were buying identity. They wanted to know what kind of car this was. Was it a supercar that demanded sacrifice? Or a luxury flagship with supercar performance? The SLR never gave a clear answer. It could dominate highways with effortless speed, yet feel cumbersome on tight circuits. It looked like a weapon, yet behaved like a Grand Tourer. It carried racing heritage, yet insulated its driver from the chaos enthusiasts secretly craved. Reviews reflected that confusion. Some praised its engineering brilliance. Others criticized its lack of emotional clarity. Many couldn't decide whether it was misunderstood or simply mispositioned. Sales told the harsher truth. The plan had been ambitious, thousands of units over many years. But interest never matched expectations. The price climbed. The competition sharpened. Buyers who wanted raw intensity looked elsewhere. Buyers who wanted pure luxury hesitated at the extremes. The SLR existed in the space between categories where admiration does not always turn into ownership. Behind closed doors, the partnership itself was changing. Mercedes was growing restless. It no longer wanted to rely on an external collaborator for its halo cars. The company had a performance division of its own, one that was maturing rapidly and demanding independence. McLaren, too, was evolving. It had learned enough, seen enough, and grown confident that its future lay not in collaboration, but in control. The SLR, once the symbol of unity, was slowly becoming the reminder of difference. No public announcement called it a failure. No scandal marked its downfall. Instead, the project simply wound down. Production slowed. Special editions appeared more focused, more extreme, almost as if the car was finally being allowed to express what it had wanted to be all along. And then, quietly, it ended. Not with outrage, not with celebration, but with unresolved questions. The tragedy of the SLR McLaren is not that it was bad. It's that it was too conflicted to ever be fully understood in its own time. And in the world of legendary cars, timing is everything. When the market rendered its verdict, by the time the Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren reached customers, the world it entered was unforgiving. This was not an era of gentle experimentation. This was the golden age of extreme machines cars that did not apologize for their purpose. Buyers spending supercar money were no longer looking for balance. They were looking for belief. They wanted a car that knew exactly what it stood for, even if that meant discomfort, fear, or obsession. And that is where the SLR's troubles deepened. On paper, the numbers were astonishing. The power figures commanded respect. The materials were exotic. The engineering budget was enormous. This was not a corner-cutting exercise, it was a technological flex. But markets don't buy spreadsheets. They buy stories. And the SLR's story was difficult to tell in a single sentence. When potential buyers compared it to its rivals, uncomfortable questions emerged. Cars in the same price orbit were unapologetically extreme. They felt lighter, sharper, more demanding. They made sacrifices obvious, and buyers embraced those sacrifices because they felt authentic. The SLR, by contrast, tried to soften the pain. It insulated noise. It prioritized long-distance comfort. It delivered devastating speed without the drama some buyers secretly wanted. For a certain type of driver, that was perfection. But for the broader supercar audience, it created emotional distance. The car did everything for you instead of with you. Critics struggled to place it. Too heavy to feel alive on tight tracks. Too stiff to feel truly relaxed as a luxury cruiser. Too expensive to be forgiven for ambiguity. The price only magnified the problem. What began as an already ambitious figure ballooned as development dragged on. Advanced materials, bespoke engineering, and the cost of a cross-company collaboration pushed the number into territory where expectations became ruthless. At that level, buyers wanted either uncompromising purity or unmistakable luxury dominance. The SLR offered something more nuanced, and nuance is dangerous in the halo car segment. Sales reflected this hesitation. Mercedes had projected a long, steady production run. Instead, the order books told a quieter story. Units moved, but not at the pace envisioned. By the time executives reviewed the figures, it was clear the car was admired more than it was desired. And admiration does not sustain supercars. Internally, patience wore thin. Mercedes executives began asking uncomfortable questions. Why was such a high-profile project not delivering the cultural impact expected? Why did the car feel more celebrated in theory than in reality? And most importantly, why was Mercedes still dependent on an external partner for its most symbolic performance product? The answer was becoming obvious. AMG was no longer just a tuning house. It was evolving into a full-fledged performance brand with its own identity, confidence, and ambition. Mercedes didn't want its future icons to be shared. It wanted them authored in-house, controlled, owned, and unmistakably Mercedes. Meanwhile, McLaren was watching closely. The SLR had taught McLaren something invaluable: how to build road cars at scale, how to navigate regulations, and how to survive outside the rarefied bubble of ultra-limited production. The partnership had been a classroom, and McLaren had graduated. Where Mercedes saw compromise, McLaren saw constraint. If McLaren was going to build its future, it would need freedom. Freedom to chase weight reduction without apology. Freedom to prioritize feel over comfort. Freedom to build cars that scared people in the way great performance machines always have. The two companies were no longer aligned. The SLR, once a symbol of unity, now stood awkwardly between diverging paths. It wasn't being canceled in disgrace. It simply no longer fit where either brand was going. And so the end began not as a headline, but as a strategic decision. Production targets were quietly revised. The long-term vision shortened. Plans shifted elsewhere. The SLR was allowed to finish its run, but it was no longer the future. What makes this moment tragic is not the decision itself, but the timing. Just as the market began to appreciate what the SLR actually was, a brutally fast, supremely engineered Grand Tourer, the industry moved on. The conversation had already shifted toward purity, lightness, and emotional extremity. The SLR hadn't failed at being fast. It hadn't failed at being advanced. It failed at fitting neatly into a narrative that buyers could instantly understand. And in a world where attention is brief and competition is merciless, that confusion proved fatal. The car did not die loudly. It faded, still powerful, still beautiful, still misunderstood. And as production wound down, one final irony emerged. Only at the end did the SLR begin to resemble the car McLaren had always wanted it to be. The split that sealed its fate. By the late 2000s, the end was no longer a question of if, only how. The partnership that had once promised to reshape the supercar world was quietly dissolving, not in anger, but in inevitability. Mercedes-Benz and McLaren had reached the same conclusion from opposite directions. The future required independence. For Mercedes, the lesson of the SLR was clarity. The company no longer wanted a halo car that needed explanation. It wanted something unmistakable visually, emotionally, philosophically Mercedes. The age of shared authorship was over. Performance would no longer be borrowed or blended. It would be built in-house, controlled from sketch to showroom. AMG was ready. What followed was not an evolution of the SLR, but a rejection of its compromises. The next flagship would be lighter, louder, more emotionally legible. It would trade subtlety for drama, long-nose elegance for muscular aggression. Where the SLR tried to balance two worlds, its successor would choose one and commit fully. McLaren, meanwhile, had reached its own awakening. The SLR had been a lesson in scale, production, and restraint, but also in frustration. Every compromise made for comfort or brand alignment felt like a dilution of purpose. McLaren had proven it could engineer brilliance. Now it wanted control over philosophy. If McLaren was going to build road cars again, they would be uncompromised, lightweight, driver-focused, unapologetically intense. Cars that didn't try to please everyone, only those who understood them. Two visions, two futures, no shared road ahead. And so the SLR was left standing between them, a car without a next chapter. Production slowed further. Public attention drifted. The industry moved on. But something interesting happened in the background. The SLR began to transform, not mechanically, but spiritually. Special editions appeared like confessions. Each one stripped away a little more restraint. Less comfort, more aggression, more honesty. It was as if the car, sensing the end, was finally being allowed to speak in its true voice. The most extreme versions were not compromises. They were declarations. And then came the final farewell. No roof, no windshield, no attempt at balance. Just raw exposure, brute force, and symbolism. This was not a car designed to sell in volume. It was a statement, one last expression of what the SLR could have been had it chosen a side from the beginning. The ultimate irony was impossible to ignore. Only at the very end did the SLR achieve absolute clarity, and then it was over. No dramatic press conference. No emotional send-off. Just the quiet end of production, the final units rolling out as the partnership officially closed its doors. The collaboration that once represented the pinnacle of engineering ambition was finished. Mercedes went one way, McLaren went another, and the SLR was left behind complete, yet unresolved. At the time, many saw this as confirmation of failure. Too heavy, too expensive, too conflicted. But history has a way of softening judgments and sharpening truths. As years passed, the narrative began to shift. Collectors started looking again, not at lap times or spec sheets, but at context. They saw a car built during a rare moment when money, ambition, and engineering excess were not constrained by caution. A car that tried to do something impossibly difficult, merged two philosophies that fundamentally resisted fusion. What once looked like confusion began to look like courage. The SLR was not a pure supercar, and it never claimed to be. It was not a traditional Mercedes either. It was something in between, born of a partnership that could only exist briefly, at a specific moment in automotive history. Its tragedy was not that it ended early. Its tragedy was that it belonged to an idea that the world quickly outgrew. Today, the SLR stands as a monument to ambition without alignment. A reminder that brilliance alone is not enough, that clarity matters just as much as capability. And perhaps that is why the SLR McLaren still lingers in conversation, not as a cautionary tale of failure, but as a beautiful, complicated answer to a question no one has dared to ask again. The legacy no one understood at first. Time does something strange to cars like the Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren. It doesn't make them faster. It doesn't make them lighter. But it changes the questions we ask about them. When the SLR disappeared from showrooms, the industry moved on quickly. New supercars arrived with sharper edges, louder personalities, and simpler narratives. The SLR was quietly filed away under a convenient label, interesting but flawed. For years, that was enough. But distance has a way of exposing shallow judgments. As the noise faded, a different picture began to emerge, one that only hindsight allows. The SLR wasn't a failed attempt at being something else. It was a successful attempt at being something the market wasn't ready to categorize. Modern enthusiasts began revisiting the car without the pressure of comparison. No laptime wars. No spec sheet battles. Just the machine itself. And suddenly, its contradictions felt intentional. The long nose that once seemed excessive now looked elegant in an era of short, aggressive silhouettes. The carbon fiber structure, once criticized for being hidden beneath luxury, was recognized as astonishingly advanced for its time. The supercharged V8, dismissed for lacking high-rev drama, became appreciated for its relentless, mechanical brutality. Most importantly, the SLR began to be seen for what it truly was. A supercar designed to endure, not impress for a single moment. It was built to cross continents at speeds few cars could sustain. To deliver performance without fragility. To offer supercar power without demanding constant sacrifice. That philosophy fell out of place in the mid-2000s, but today, it feels almost rebellious. Because modern supercars have become narrow in focus. They chase numbers. They chase theatrics. They chase social media moments. The SLR chased longevity. Owners began speaking differently about it. Not in terms of track dominance, but in stories. Long journeys. High mileage. Reliability that bordered on absurd for a car of its class. A sense that the car wasn't constantly threatening to punish its driver. Collectors noticed, values stabilized, then slowly climbed. But more important than price was perception. The SLR stopped being the compromised one and started becoming the unique one. A car that could never be replicated because the conditions that created it no longer exist. No modern manufacturer would approve such a project today. The budget would be questioned. The positioning would be challenged. The compromises would be rejected by committees. The SLR came from a brief era when engineering ambition overpowered market fear. When two giants were willing to spend excessively just to see what would happen. And what happened was something imperfect, but unforgettable. That is the quiet truth of its legacy. The SLR didn't fail because it lacked brilliance. It failed because it demanded patience from an impatient world. Today, that patience has finally arrived. The car no longer needs to explain itself. It no longer needs to choose a side. It exists as proof that not all great machines are born from certainty. Some are born from tension. Some are born from disagreement. And some, like the Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren, are remembered not because they were the best at one thing, but because they dared to be different when differences carried a cost. And that may be the most tragic and most beautiful part of its story. The quiet goodbye of a misunderstood icon. The Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren did not end with a crash, a scandal, or a dramatic recall. It ended the way it lived, quietly misunderstood. Its final days were not marked by outrage or celebration. Production simply slowed. The line ran out. The partnership closed its chapter. And just like that, one of the most ambitious supercar experiments of the modern era was gone. No successor carried its philosophy forward. No lineage absorbed its DNA. No modern car truly replaced it. And that is what makes its ending tragic. Because the SLR was never meant to be disposable. It was overbuilt, over-engineered, designed with a confidence that assumed permanence. Its carbon fiber structure was created to last decades. Its powertrain was tuned for endurance, not fragility. Its design was not chasing trends, it was asserting identity. Yet the world around it moved faster than the car itself. Mercedes walked away toward clarity and ownership. McLaren walked away toward purity and control. And the SLR was left behind as the final artifact of a partnership that could only exist once. In retrospect, the The SLR didn't fail because it lacked purpose. It failed because it carried two purposes at the same time. It asked a question the market didn't want to answer. Can a supercar be brutally fast and civilized? Can it be extreme without being exhausting? Can it be engineered for obsession and longevity? The industry answered no and moved on. But time has a way of challenging first answers. Today, the SLR exists in a different light. Not as a mistake, not as a compromise, but as a moment frozen between eras. A machine born before supercars became content, metrics, and algorithms. It belongs to a time when companies chased engineering truth more than narrative simplicity. That is why its end still feels unresolved. Not because it deserved more praise, but because it deserved more understanding. The Mercedes-Benz SLR McLaren wasn't ahead of its time in performance. It was ahead of its time in philosophy. And philosophies are always lonely at first. That is the real tragedy. Not that the SLR ended early, but that it arrived in a world that hadn't yet learned how to value what it truly was.